This was a randomized experiment in Sierra Leone trying to study the local institutional reform that tried to improve local governance in rural Sierra Leone. So this is a program that was implemented just a couple years after the end of the Civil War in Sierra Leone, which was a very brutal civil war. And the idea was that rural institutions in Sierra Leone were weak and quite undemocratic before the war. They were dominated by traditional chiefs. There was very little scope for meaningful participation in local politics in rural areas. But the hope was, look, maybe we can try out some new models at the village level, and if they work, extend them nationwide to bring much more grassroots democracy into villages in Sierra Leone to make sure we don't have the dissatisfaction and the anger that contributed to the Civil War. Okay, so what is the program doing? Let's get into the nitty-gritty about what this program does. 3 elements. Number 1, big grants. Huge transfer. This is very typical for community-driven development. Big cash transfers come in as part of the program. So it's not just institutional reform, it's also resources for these new institutions to use. So it's the equivalent of about $100 per household in a transfer. In a place where per capita income in exchange rate terms may be $300 or $400. This is a lot of money. It's a big transfer. And it was delivered in 3 tranches, so there could kind of be multiple projects funded by these communities. The second piece was a training piece to make government more efficient. There was training in bookkeeping and financial practices. There was a lot of contact. 1 day a week for 3.5 years, there was a representative of the project that spent a day in the village training local government officials, holding meetings, trying to elicit preferences for local projects. 1 day a week for 3.5 years. It's a huge investment, actually. It was very expensive. And as part of that, an elected village development committee was formed. So an elected government. Finally, there were some mandates to increase representation by marginalized groups. There had to be some female representation on the village development committee. And a certain share of money was directed to projects run by women's groups and youth groups. And the youth could be male or female youth groups. But the idea was to get some of the money out of the hands of the male elders. Okay, this is just a map of Sierra Leone. You can see Freetown over here. You know, there's a political party that dominates the north and a political party that dominates the south. So there was one study area in both regions for political reasons. And then treatment and control was randomized within these areas. So what did people spend the money on? When they got all these cash transfers and these committees were set up and they had all these meetings and took votes to figure out what to spend money on, they spent it on a bunch of different things. But there were really 2 main categories. One was just infrastructure. They built latrines. They built school classrooms. They built wells. They built bridges. So if you're living here and there's a river between the 2 sides of your village or between your village and the next one, it's actually really important to have a bridge of some kind. So that was about half the money. They also built, this was a pretty common one, drying floors, rice drying floors, a flat concrete surface where you can dry your rice before selling it. Now, it turns out if you don't have that, you have to dry your rice on the dirt. A lot of rocks get in there and dirt gets in there. So it's actually very important to have a communal drying floor. That was another common investment. Livelihood activities. A lot in agriculture, seeds, livestock, things to invest in agriculture. And a chunk went outside of agriculture. Training. There was some that went into training to become a carpenter or to become, have a skill. Some went into buying tools for soap making. So a little bit of small business activity, especially some of the money that went to the women's groups and the youth groups here. So what do we find? This is a good program. This was well implemented, well monitored. There was a lot of money, and it had some positive benefits. So first of all, the village development committees were set up. Like the things the project said it would set up, the local institutions after during the 4 years really were set up. And we can trace that 87% of the money that was sent from the capital actually was spent locally. The other 13% we can't exactly track. Some of it may have been leaked or stolen. Some of it could just be bad bookkeeping. So this is the combination of those 2 things. This is a very low leakage level. So this is a good program. Stuff was dispersed, and things got built. Contractors built things. Along every measure, there were increases in the stocks of all the relevant public goods, the latrines, the drying floors, the schools. Stuff really got built. That was great. But when we look at the other class of outcomes, and this is where things get controversial, and this is where the research design becomes really critical in some ways, we don't find impacts. Again, we had hundreds of measures of gender inclusion, of democratic decision-making, on social capital, on community participation in governance, all these positive attributes of active local governance and democratic governance. We don't find impacts on them. We don't find increased collective action capacity in terms of fundraising after the grants run out. Okay, so nothing sort of changed. So we're collecting this data. We're getting these results in. And at this point, we're really happy we had a pre-analysis plan. And why is that? Right at the point we're getting all of our data in and we're registering our pre-analysis plan, a qualitative study, a very good qualitative study, was done by some researchers funded by the World Bank that went to, I think, 12 communities and spoke to people, maybe it was 15 communities out of the 236, and really spoke in depth to residents in these different communities. And they wrote an incredibly strong report making the case that there was greater gender inclusion, there was greater youth inclusion, there were all kinds of benefits in terms of local democracy and governance. So maybe it was just the sample of villages they looked at, but we don't get those results. And our concern a little bit, and this is true of experimental research as much as qualitative, is if you have a lot of leeway in choosing the outcomes you focus on, there could be cherry picking or there could be selective reporting. So we decided to use pre-analysis plan. So how do we do that? Right at the beginning of the program, we were already interested in this notion of a pre-analysis plan and already a little bit concerned that there were a lot of outcomes people were talking about. There were a lot of different dimensions, a lot of things that could be affected. So at the beginning of the program, 2005, we got our partners to agree to a set of outcomes and hypotheses already. So ultimately, we have 12 families of hypotheses, 12 sets of hypotheses. We already had 10 of them in 2005. Social capital, gender inclusion, participation, trust, all that stuff that you would think of. We wrote those in, and we have a hypothesis document. And about half the outcomes were already in the baseline survey. And I think, again, the intellectual point is, tying our hands a little bit and forcing ourselves to report these outcomes prevents us from just telling a great story.